Boston, Massachusetts. The year is 1700. The sun hasn't risen yet, and the streets already carry a smell that would stop you cold. Not bread. Not wood smoke. Something heavier. Something that sits in your throat and doesn't leave. A woman opens a second-floor window. She holds a ceramic pot in both hands. Without looking down, without warning, she tips it over the edge. The contents hit the frozen mud below with a dull, wet thud. She closes the window and goes back to bed. This was not a scandal. This was not a crime. This was Tuesday morning in colonial America. And if you think that's the worst of it, you have no idea what's coming. Most people picture colonial America as something out of a painting. Wooden churches, candlelit kitchens, families around a fire. But the paintings always left out everything below the frame. The streets, the water, the bodies. Walk through Boston on a warm July afternoon. The main road is a dirt path churned up by horses and cattle. On either side, the mud is a mixture of animal waste, rotting food, and the contents of every chamber pot dumped that morning. The smell rises in waves. It wraps around you. It clings to your coat. This wasn't a city in decline. It was a city at its finest, and it wasn't unique to Boston. Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Every colonial settlement ran on the same invisible system. No pipes, no drainage, no concept of modern sanitation. Just the idea that if you throw it outside, it becomes someone else's problem. The chamber pot, a simple ceramic or tin bowl kept under the bed, was the universal solution to human waste. Everyone had one. Everyone used one. And every morning, the contents had to go somewhere. In Europe, people had developed a habit of shouting a warning before tossing it from a window. The phrase came from France, gardez-l'eau, watch out for the water. That habit crossed the Atlantic. So did the pot. So did everything it carried. Now consider the physical structure of colonial homes. The privy, a basic hole in the ground with a wooden shelter, was a later development, and even then it was usually dug near the vegetable garden. Colonists believed human waste was useful for crops. They weren't entirely wrong, but they were entirely unaware of what else it was doing. Animals made it worse. Not just stray dogs, pigs, dozens roaming freely through the streets of Philadelphia and Boston, eating garbage, rooting through mud. They were encouraged because they cleaned up organic waste. That worked in the narrowest sense while creating an entirely different set of problems. Horses. Cattle herded through town on the way to slaughter. Chickens in the yard next to the kitchen. The line between where animals lived and where people lived was blurry at best. In poorer households, it didn't exist at all. Benjamin Franklin, who grew up in Boston before moving to Philadelphia, complained about this in 1739. He wrote about slaughterhouses next to homes and the smell hanging over the city in summer. He was ahead of his time on sanitation. But in 1739, nobody was ready to listen. Now think about the water. The primary water source in most colonial towns was the well. A hole dug into the ground, drawing up groundwater. Simple, logical. But colonial wells were dug close to homes, and close to homes meant close to privies. A privy is just a hole in the ground with nothing between its contents and the water table. The distance between a typical well and the nearest privy was often less than 15 meters, the length of a city bus. In some cases, less than 10. The soil filtered some of it. Not enough. Not even close. People knew the water tasted off sometimes. They didn't know why. Germ theory was still a century and a half away. So they drank the water, felt sick occasionally, assumed it was the weather or God's will, and moved on, or they drank beer. Colonial families, including children, drank beer every single day. Not because they were alcoholics, but because beer was safer than water. The brewing process involves boiling. Boiling kills bacteria. Nobody understood that in 1700, they just noticed that people who drank beer got sick less often than people who drank from the well. Beer became the default beverage at every meal, including breakfast. John Adams wrote about starting his mornings as a child with a pot of hard cider and salted fish. Schoolchildren in Massachusetts received small beer, a low-alcohol brew of maybe 2%, as part of their daily diet. A mother serving her 5-year-old a mug of beer at breakfast wasn't neglectful. She was, by the standards of the time, being careful. That detail stops people cold because it shows how far removed colonial life was from anything we recognize today. If the water and streets were that dangerous, what happened when people got sick? The medicine of 1700 was guesswork wrapped in authority. The dominant theory of disease was miasma, the idea that illness came from bad air, from anything that smelled fall. That put them in the right neighborhood. Sanitation matters, but their reasoning was completely wrong. Bloodletting was standard. A patient with a fever would be blood, sometimes half a liter removed in a single session. The logic was that illness lived in the blood. Removing blood weakened the patient, and the doctor would interpret that as the fever breaking. Sometimes the patient recovered. Often they didn't. Calomel, a compound of mercury, was prescribed as a purgative. It caused nerve damage, tooth loss, and organ failure. It was used routinely on children. George Washington, in December 1799, developed a severe throat infection. His doctors bled him 4 times in a single day, removing close to 2.5 liters of blood. He died within hours. The infection would likely have been survivable with rest and fluids. The treatment finished him. The father of a nation, killed by the medicine meant to save him. But there were other voices. Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister who fueled the Salem witch trials, owned an enslaved man named Onesimus. Onesimus described a practice from Africa. A small amount of material from a smallpox sore introduced into a cut on the skin could protect a person from the full disease. We now call this variolation, a crude but functional precursor to vaccination. During the 1721 smallpox epidemic in Boston, Mather pushed for variolation. The city erupted. A pipe bomb was thrown through his window. Physicians publicly condemned him. The idea of deliberately infecting someone with smallpox sounded like madness. But it worked. The people who were variolated died at a fraction of the rate of those who weren't. The data was right there. It took decades for the medical establishment to accept it. The knowledge that could have saved lives was already there, carried in the memory of an enslaved man. And the system that could have used it spent years throwing pipe bombs at the idea instead. Disease didn't wait politely outside the city limits. Dysentery spread through contaminated wells, through food handled by unwashed hands. Typhoid followed the same path. Smallpox needed only a single infected person in a crowded church on a Sunday morning. The mortality rate for children under 5 in colonial America was roughly 1 in 4. 1 child in 4 dying before their 5th birthday. Not in the abstract. In every family, on every street. Cotton Mather lost 9 of his 15 children to infectious disease. He buried them, grieved them, and kept watching the next wave of illness roll in. 9 children. 9 funerals. Where were the bodies going? They were buried in church graveyards at the center of town. That made spiritual sense. Keep the congregation close to the church in life and in death. But it made no sanitary sense at all. A churchyard fills up. The soil becomes saturated with decomposition, and that saturation moves down toward the groundwater, toward the wells, toward the mouths of the living. Here is the thing about the Puritans. The popular image is of a deeply clean, morally rigid people. That image is wrong. Puritan cleanliness was a spiritual concept. The body was less important than the soul. Bathing was considered medically dangerous. Physicians believed open pores allowed miasma to enter the body. A full bath might be taken once or twice a year. Lice were so common they were treated as a condition of existence. A Puritan minister could stand at his pulpit on a Sunday morning, clothing unchanged for 2 weeks, and deliver a sermon about spiritual purity without irony. This is not mockery. This is what the world looked like before germ theory. One last image. The year is 1657. New Amsterdam, the Dutch settlement that would become New York, passes one of the first anti-littering laws in colonial North America. The ordinance prohibits dumping garbage, waste, and oyster shells into public streets. The penalty is a fine. The law is largely ignored, but it exists. Someone looked at the street outside their window and thought, there has to be a better way. The real turning point wouldn't come for another 150 years. It came from London in the summer of 1858, when a heat wave turned the River Thames, carrying the raw sewage of more than 2 million people into something so overwhelming that Parliament's windows had to be soaked in chloride of lime. They called it the Great Stink. Parliament, forced to sit inside the problem they had created, finally funded a modern sewer system. Every time you turn on a tap and clean water comes out, something real happened to make that possible. Generations of people died from things that are now preventable. The toilet you take for granted is one of the most consequential inventions in human history. Not because it's comfortable, because it broke the cycle. And if there is one thing this story keeps coming back to, it is that the things we never think about are usually the things that matter most.